the message of managing the risk of fatigue is relevant no matter where we are. So thank you for letting us do this here. Mitch Cowart of Caterpillar is going to speak about fatigue risk management and are we fit for duty. So Mitch, thank you for joining us today.
So let's be clear, Perry was in Athens, Greece. I was in Peoria, Illinois at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Skype call, all right? Thank you, Perry. You know, every day millions of people are showing up to work in high-risk occupations that require high levels of attention, perception, and situational awareness. And when we talk to supervisors and managers in the pipeline industry, they all tell us that they're struggling to keep productivity up, keep their costs down, and keep their people safe. And to that end, they're looking for any kind of lever, a new technology, big data analytics, the Internet of Things, unmanned aerial vehicles, artificial intelligence, augmented reality. Some folks might even be using remote-controlled equipment. Some might be using off-site command centers to run multiple machines remotely. Undoubtedly, there's some folks in boardrooms around the world imagining creating positive futures using autonomous equipment one day. But until that day becomes a reality, we're convinced that you're already heavily invested in the most sophisticated technology that's available on the planet today. And that's a network of massively parallel electrochemical digital computers that run on glycogen and oxygen. And it's this network of biological computers that all of your companies are relying on to operate all of your equipment, make all of your important decisions. But when we talk to managers and supervisors, they expect workers to show up well-rested and ready to perform at optimal levels, but they tell us from their own personal experience that a lot of workers struggle with fatigue. They struggle to maintain attention, perception, and situational awareness. But what they don't know is how much fatigue is costing them in terms of lost productivity, inefficiency, increased maintenance and repairs, and the risk of serious injuries or fatalities. Some of you may recognize this vessel and recall that on March 24th in 1989, the Valdez struck the Bligh Reef in Prince William Sound. And you might not remember this one detail. It happened at 4 minutes after midnight. Some of you probably recall how the ship captain, Joseph Hazelwood, was absolutely lambasted in the media because he'd been drinking heavily right before the incident had occurred. I've read the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board Marine Accident Report, and the report says that Captain Hazelwood wasn't at the controls when the accident occurred. In fact, he was in his cabin asleep. See, earlier in the day, while the crude was being onboarded onto the vessel, he took some personal leave, went ashore, take care of some personal business, and before returning back to the vessel, he stopped by to get some pizzas made for the crew. And while some of the pizzas were getting made, he imbibed in a few adult beverages and then returned back to the vessel. And the crew surprised him and said, "Boss, you're going to be so proud of us. We really hustled. All the materials on board, and Exxon wants us to leave now, right away." And he said, "I'm not fit for duty." And so he retired to his cabin and put the third mate in charge. The problem is the third mate hadn't slept in 24 hours. In fact, the report says that the probable cause of the grounding of the Exxon Valdez was the failure of the third mate to properly maneuver the vessel because of fatigue and excessive workload. What is excessive workload for a biological computer? The human brain is the most sophisticated computer in the world. It's so powerful with hundreds of billions of neurons and trillions of logic gates or synapses. And some estimate that the human brain has the computing power of about 4.5 million desktop computers. 4.5 million in this little bulb Chrome dome. Can you believe it? You probably don't, and I don't either, but that was a joke, folks. This, the thing is, what you can believe is this biological computer only uses about 25 watts of power per day. Incredible. 25 watts of power fueled by glycogen and oxygen. But that amounts to about 25% of my total caloric intake devoted to running the biological computer. That's more than 10 times of any other organ in our bodies. Now, during the tough times of our evolutionary history, during drought and famine, our brain developed an efficient fuel management system. You can think of it as cognitive capacity. And what it did is it limited what we would focus on so that we didn't burn so many calories focusing on everything in our visual perception system. We learned to focus and only think and concentrate on what was critical. And actually, cognitive capacity, it's a little bit like my bank account. It's very limited. And a bank account's a good analogy because it's out of our cognitive capacity that we pay attention. And really, paying attention is the key to safety incidents and reducing those. So what are the things that make it difficult for us to pay attention? Well, I already mentioned that the brain runs on glycogen, so nutrition is critical to paying attention. How many of you know how to extend the battery life of your mobile device? Talk to a 12-year-old. They'll tell you, what do you do to extend the life of the battery in your mobile phone? You dim the light. How about closing some of those apps that are running in the background? You guys know that trick? So stress and hunger and anxiety are like apps running in the background of our cognition, and they're using up cognitive capacity. So if you have stress around health or marriage or children, you're using up cognitive capacity. Also, complexity. So the more complex the job site, the more people on the ground, vehicles coming and going, makes it more difficult to hold that map in our mind of all that's the situational awareness around us so that we can continue to understand where all the elements on the playing field are. And then fatigue, and we're going to focus on that in some more depth. You know, it was in 1942, only about 8% of the population was trying to get by on 6 hours or less each night. Anybody want to guess nowadays what percentage of the population is sleeping 6 hours or less? Huh? Who? Half. That's exactly right. Thank you for engaging here. Yeah, somebody get this guy the prize. That's right, half of us. In fact, so many things are keeping us from sleep. I once read that the CEO of Netflix was pontificating about the competition to his business. And interestingly, it wasn't cable TV, it wasn't Blockbuster video, it wasn't movie theaters. He said the number one competition for Netflix was sleep. Now, according to the problem at this point is so prolific that Professor Matthew Walker, who is the director for the Center for Human Sleep Science, says that we're now in the midst of a catastrophic sleep loss epidemic. We thought COVID was the problem. It's actually sleep deprivation. And according to researchers at Harvard Medical School, they conducted a study that showed that insomnia is costing the average worker about 11 days in lost productivity. Now, that's not a lost time incident. That's folks are at work, but they're just not being as productive. So 11 days of lost productivity amounts to about $3,000 per person, and per year that equates to about $63 billion per year in lost productivity due to sleep deprivation. Now, more than 20 large-scale epidemiological studies reveals that the shorter you sleep, the shorter you live. In fact, sleep deprivation, and again, that's classified as getting less than 7 hours a night, has been linked to a host of diseases, including Alzheimer's and cancer and diabetes and obesity and heart disease, stroke, hyperglycemia, poor mental health, among others. So to say this a little bit more positive, sleep long, live long. I'm going to share a little bit more information with you. An assessment of occupational injuries to a representative sample of U.S. adults reveals that the injury rate associated with working 60 hours per week is 23% higher than folks that work less than 60 hours a week. If you work more than 12 hours a day, your chances of incurring an injury goes up by 37%. And if you work overtime, you have a 61% increased chance of suffering an injury at work compared to those who aren't on overtime. Now, the U.S. Department of Transportation conducted a study. They looked at operator fatigue and its economic impact and discovered that rail operators have a 62% increased chance of an accident, and the cost of a fatigue-related accident is 400% higher than a non-fatigue-related accident. To conduct that study, they used an algorithm that was developed by the U.S. Army Research Lab. The algorithm is called SAFETY. It's an acronym. It stands for Sleep, Activity, Fatigue, and Task Effectiveness. And it is an algorithm that quantifies on a scale of 0 to 100, a person's cognitive impairment as a function of sleep, where a score of 90 or higher indicates normal levels of cognitive effectiveness, but anything below 90 would indicate some level of impairment. And you can't see it on the slide here, but 70 down at the bottom is the equivalent of 0.08 blood alcohol concentration. When you have a safety score of 70, you have more than a 5 times chance of suffering a lapse in attention, and your response time slow by about 43%. So with that information, it'll make sense to you when I tell you that the U.S. Department of Transportation found that workers whose alertness levels were 70 or below had accidents that were 5 times more expensive than workers whose alertness levels were 90 or higher. Now, why is sleep so critical to cognitive effectiveness? There's a whole bunch of reasons. I'd love to spend another 4 hours with you talking about this, but I want to share just this one with you. Sleep is when your brain gets washed. That's right, folks. Brain washing should be an important part of your daily personal hygiene routine. Of course, I don't recommend you use soap and bubbles and brushes because your brain has a dedicated filtration system. It's called a glymphatic system. It's a hydraulic system. It uses a very special fluid, like spinal fluid, that washes through the crevices of your brain when you're in your deepest phase of sleep. And if it's washing out the toxins that build up in your brain each day from the food you eat, the things you drink, the particulates in the air, chemicals that you might come in contact with. I don't know how you guys feel about the smell of WD-40, but I love it. And of course, that's not good for my brain. And even exercise builds up toxins in your brain each day. And so those toxins need to be cleaned out. It's the glymphatic system that does that. And if you don't spend enough time in your deepest phase of sleep, then you get a toxic buildup. Another way we say that, you're intoxicated. Now, other threats from workplace safety, like those from drugs or alcohol, those can be mitigated and detected with vigilant screening. but unfortunately, there's no breathalyzer or urine test for fatigue. So many organizations are relying on behavior observation. This guy over here, he looks like he's fatigued. And, or self-declaration. How many of you have gone to work and told your boss, I'm too tired to work today, boss? Doesn't happen. We don't do it. And so these methods are ineffective for managing an integrated network of biological control modules. So what does it look like for a driver who is chronically fatigued? This video data was gathered by Caterpillar's driver safety system. I'm going to tell you more about that in a moment. But you can note in the timestamp in the lower right corner here that this operator is driving for more than 30 seconds with his eyes closed. At just 30 miles an hour, that's a quarter of a mile that he traveled with his eyes closed. I could tell you more about this guy. He was with the company for 10 years, valued operator, works alone in his haul truck every day. Nobody knows that he's suffering like this, and he's gutting it out day after day. This is John Horn. John is the director. He's actually now the VP of safety at Nutrien, formerly Potash, where that last video was captured. In this video, John's telling a story about a young haul truck driver who came to work at their phosphate mine in Aurora, North Carolina, and fell asleep during the pre-shift safety meeting. Nobody said anything. When the meeting was over, they elbowed him and said, hey, bud, it's time to get to work. And he climbs up in his haul truck, and like you do, you get to work. After an hour or so, he nodded off at the wheel, and he brushed mirrors, that side mirror that's sticking out there on the side of the haul truck. He literally brushed mirrors with another haul truck on the haul road, nearly a head-on collision. Neither one of them told anybody that that had just happened. Another hour later, the young haul truck driver suffered another microsleep, and he drove over a light vehicle with a man inside. It took him more than 3 hours to get the man out of the light vehicle. He lived. He lived. And they fired the haul truck driver because he wasn't fit for duty that day. Why? Why wasn't he fit for duty? He was out all night with the boys? No. He's out playing softball with his church softball league? No. He was in the emergency room all night with his young wife who had just miscarried their first baby. And he didn't know how to have that crucial conversation with his supervisor. Raise his hand and say, sir, today I'm not fit for duty. Because he was enculturated by his daddy and his brothers and his sports coaches to grit his teeth and play through the pain, just like every one of us. And that's exactly what he did. He did what he was taught to do. Suck it up, get tough, and get your butt back to work. Now, the companies that are serious about addressing this problem, they're taking steps to help them see and mitigate and manage this invisible threat to their operations. Caterpillar's been working at this. Customers have been coming to us with stories like Brad's for nearly 15 years. And in the background, some of my colleagues, the vigilantes of safety professionals at Caterpillar that Perry mentioned, we've been working on this problem, and we've identified 5 essential questions that every organization must ask themselves. So I'm going to share with you 5 essential questions, and if you're taking notes, I encourage you to write these down. The first one is, do we have a process to manage our journey to zero? Zero fatigue-related incidents. Do we have a process? Caterpillar has a continuous improvement process. This slide illustrates our own safety journey at Caterpillar. You'll note that we've had a 93% improvement in our recordable injury frequency since 2003, even though our number of employees has increased by over 50,000 employees during that time. We've achieved these results through a process we call ZIP. ZIP is a continuous improvement, sustainable safety culture improvement model. It's built on the core principles of a visible commitment to demonstrate safety as a value. Super important, a visible commitment, not just words. Employee engagement across all levels of the organization. Especially those workers that are closest to the risk. And then finally, very deliberate processes of accountability and recognition. This process is so effective, we now offer to teach it to our customers. If you want to learn more about that, you can talk to Perry Redmond. Question number 2, how are cultural stigmas frustrating our journey to zero? Fatigue is so complex. It's correlated to our humanity, to human factors. And so we have to explore the cultural stigmas that frustrate our journey to zero. How many of you recognize the name Chelsea Sullenberger? Anybody recognize that name? How about if I say Sully? Sully was the captain of the U.S. Airways plane that crash landed in the Hudson, and Tom Hanks played Captain Chelsea Sullenberger in a movie called Sully. Here's the real Sully talking about his alertness, vigilance, fatigue, and his ability to adhere to the emergency protocols that saved all those people on that flight.
On your fateful flight, if you'd been tired, would you have been able to make the same decisions, go into the Hudson?
I don't know that we would have been able to do that as well.
Really?
And so I'm convinced that had we been tired, had we not gotten sufficient rest the night before, we could not have performed at the same level. The fact that we got so much, so right, so quickly under that sudden stress is a testament not only to our training, but the fact that we had a chance to get sufficient rest.
If you'd had a bad night's sleep, would you have made a different decision, or you might have?
I might not have been able to perform as well. I might ultimately have made the same decisions, perhaps a bit slower, and my ultimate decision of when to begin to raise the nose would have been much more difficult.
No pilot wants to fly tired, but we've talked to lots of pilots who say because of the economics of everything, they don't get a real good night's sleep before they begin their trips.
From studying the science of safety, we know that nothing happens in isolation. We have to consider the environment in which we operate and the culture of our companies. And that means we need to have a system that consistently schedules pilots to get sufficient rest.
Is that system in place today?
Not completely. In fact, one of the things that's going on right now is the FAA is in the rulemaking process to update our flight time and duty time rules for the first time in over a generation.
Some of the pilots have told us if they call in fatigue, that's a black mark on them.
I think in many cases they face sanction, or they run the risk of facing sanction. And even if they don't face sanction, they're given a lot of pressure that, oh, you need to, because otherwise there's no one else to do it. We'll cancel the flight, or they'll threaten you.
We'll threaten you. We'll pressure you. How do we pressure each other? One of the ways that we do that is through shame. Pictured here is Dr. Brene Brown. Dr. Brown is a research sociologist at the University of Houston. She's a prolific author with a number of excellent books. I recommend her book on leadership. But she's probably most famous for her incredibly popular TED Talk on shame. She spent her 20-year career studying shame, and what she's learned is that for males, the primary source of shame, perceived weakness. No male wants to be perceived as weak, and so he will engage in all kinds of at-risk behavior in order to avoid the shame of perceived weakness. Now, for the ladies in the room, they're like, somebody had to spend 20 years to research that? It's obvious. For females, it's perceived imperfection. Our culture puts tremendous pressure on females to be perfect. Often when I talk in more detail on this topic with fleet managers in various industries, they go, oh man, that makes so much sense. I'm like, what's that? They said, well, often I thought I was noticing that when I had a female operator in a machine, my number of repairs went down. And I went, makes total sense, because once you train her to operate the machine perfectly, she does everything in her power to do it perfectly. Whereas a guy, he's going to see if it'll do a wheelie. Like, can I spin the tires? You know, like, how much will this thing lift? You know, he's going to push the limits. When you understand that and combine it with the fact that 80% of us suffer from the optimism bias. Now, that's what behavioral psychologists call the thinking error that causes someone to believe that they themselves are less likely to experience a negative event. So every time I operate a vehicle and text and get away with it, it tells me that, man, I'm really tough, I'm really good at doing this, I'm really lucky, or somebody upstairs is watching out for me. And it tells me, it reinforces that behavior and says, I can keep getting away with this. By the way, please don't text and drive. And so, like so many of the speakers over the past 24 hours have been saying, 90% of quality, 90% of performance, and 90% of safety is really about behavior. And at-risk behavior, incidents like the one pictured here, isn't caused by conditions. It's not caused by some sort of equipment failure. It's caused because somebody took a chance. And they took a chance because of attitudes, beliefs. How many times are we going to say this in the past 24 hours? Attitudes, beliefs, values, and ideals. And when everyone on the team shares those same attitudes, values, beliefs, ideals, those are what we call norms. People like us, we do things like this. This is who we are. This is what we're about. And that creates this reinforcing feedback loop we call culture. Wow, culture. We keep talking about it. Caterpillar's Pipeline Machinery International Group presents a safety leadership training program with specific scenarios, conditions, and environments that depict the scenarios and conditions that pipeliners operate in every day. This program is packed with a real-life examples explored through engaging videos, role-playing exercises, interactive activities, provocative discussion topics. It's a training program designed specifically for the pipeline industry to help leaders at all levels gain insight into their role in influencing the attitudes, beliefs, values, ideals, and ultimately the behaviors that drive culture in the pipeline industry. So if you're interested in learning more about this training program that's about culture in the pipeline industry, you can talk to Perry Redmond. This leads me to question number 3, the third essential question. Are workers getting sufficient quality and quantity of sleep? And you may be saying, how could I possibly know that? Well, that's why Caterpillar offers a fatigue risk assessment. We've actually hired human fatigue experts and put together a program that enables organizations in the pipeline industry, mining, construction, to see this invisible threat to their operation. When I'm talking about seeing, I'm talking about having a vision for 0 fatigue incidents. I'm talking about visibility to data, to the scale and scope of the problem, and I'm talking about having insight into the problem and how might we make a difference and make changes. Where vision is about leadership development, going back to that last slide on the pipeline culture training program that we've developed, and equipping leaders with a vision for 0 by teaching them about the neurology, physiology, psychology around fatigue, those cultural stigmas, and also helping them develop a plan for change management to address the hearts and minds of workers. When we talk about visibility, we're talking about using technology wearables, in-cab technology that measure human fatigue and the number of fatigue incidents we might be having. And we collect baseline data to understand the current state of fatigue in the organization. We engage, then we start to measure after some training of the workers closest to the risk. We have a training program we call Managing Fatigue at Work. And we measure, once we make each worker accountable, what difference, how much improvement can we make? So that's what we call active engagement, engaging those workers closest to the risk. And then finally, helping develop a fatigue intervention plan, piloting that plan and measuring the difference. Then we gain the insights by analyzing, slicing and dicing that data, coming up with recommendations to help you develop a comprehensive fatigue risk management plan in your organization. Question number 4, do workers have sufficient opportunities to get sleep? This is really the question that Brad was presenting us with. 18-hour days, 38 days in a row. Did his son have sufficient opportunities to get sleep? I don't think so. And so every creature on earth, let's just admit it, becomes fatigued. But they take countermeasures to reduce the risks associated with fatigue. If you have a pet at home right now, what's it doing? Every creature but this one. This is the only creature that deliberately ignores fatigue and deprives ourselves of sleep. And so we have to take that into consideration and remember that the excessive work hours, prolonged work cycles, 24-hour operations, long commutes, like Brad's son was making, hour and a half each way, these challenge people's opportunities for sleep. And so at Caterpillar, we use the fatigue avoidance scheduling tool. This is a software tool developed by the U.S. Air Force to help minimize risk for jet pilots. And we now use it on behalf of our clients to understand or optimize schedules for cognitive effectiveness. It's probably the only scheduling tool that is prioritizing cognitive performance. I can tell you more about that, or you can talk to Perry. So let's just say that you've written down these first 4 essential questions and taken them to heart. And you take them back to your operation and you convince them to implement a process to achieve safety excellence by engaging the workforce and to design, policies that help you support your culture. And you conduct some training sessions, like our Managing Fatigue at Work training sessions, to help you address the hearts and minds of the workforce. And then you use the FAST scheduling tool to optimize your schedule for cognitive effectiveness as a function of fitness for duty. There's still more to do. There's one last essential question, and that is, what about controls to protect those workers who are most exposed? And that's because fatigue is real, and managing it requires the power to see and mitigate and manage this threat. And so the next layer of protection, the one that delivers the power to see and mitigate and manage, is technology. So let's focus in for just a few minutes on the technology that we've been working on. For equipment operators, the highest priority is to ensure that that biological control module in the seat remains in the seat. But due to the optimism bias, many operators think that seatbelts are unnecessary. I'm not going that fast after all. I've got the rollover protection. I can't really reach everything. It's kind of uncomfortable, so I really don't want to wear the seatbelt. But OSHA incident data reveals that you can avoid all fatalities with rollover protection and a seatbelt. Their data says if you have both, the operator wearing a seatbelt and rollover protection, 0 fatalities occur when in a rollover incident. That's a good return on investment. And so CAT now has a seatbelt reminder that uses some in-cab technology to remind the operator to wear his seatbelt. But even as importantly, that beacon on the top there mounts on top of the cab, on top of the machine, and when it's lit, it would indicate that the seatbelt isn't buckled, but the machine is in motion. And so in that way, we can actually hold one another accountable and be our brother's keeper, like Brad was talking about. Now, if you've got the operator safely in the seat, the next thing to address is attention, the thing that humans struggle with most. And so we could use some technology to help as a tension support system. Texas Mutual Insurance is the state's biggest workers' compensation underwriter. And they report that oil and gas companies filed 24 claims for fatal highway accidents in just 7 months between January and July of 2014. Texas Mutual's vice president for safety says that they see a high incident of motor vehicle drivers who've worked 14-hour shifts in oil field operations fall asleep at the wheel, just like Brad's son, Chad. To his point, in January of 2014, there were seven co-workers that were killed after they had completed a 24-hour shift. The driver fell asleep at the wheel, ran into the back of that school bus. 3 of the workers were killed and 4 others suffered injuries because that driver fell asleep at the wheel. Now, paying attention over long shifts is so difficult for humans. So CAT offers an attention support system. We call it the driver safety system. And it uses some in-cab technology that focuses on the operator's head and face. It reads more than 60 facial features that could indicate a lapse in attention. And when it detects an operator suffering a lapse in attention, it intervenes with a vigorous seat vibration and an audible alarm to nudge him back to alertness. Now, those were actors in a mining haul truck, but I assure you, this technology that I'm showing you can go in anything, even a light vehicle, a company pickup truck going down the highway. Here's an example of an operator, actual driver safety system footage, suffering a lapse in attention at just the moment that he's headed right toward another vehicle. And here's an example of a lapse in attention some of you may be familiar with. You think, well, this is absolutely forbidden at my company. It was forbidden at this company too. And he knew there was a camera on the dash. But what we found is, how many of you can remember the days when your kids were toddlers? Some of you may have kids who are toddlers. What happens when toddlers start getting sleepy and it gets about bedtime? What do? What's the behavior like? They start getting active. They start kind of running around. How many times have they conked their coconut on the coffee table right before bedtime? That's because they're trying to engage their brain and stay awake. And that's what he's doing. He's using a mobile device in order to try and stay awake, even though he knows that there's a camera and he knows there's a zero tolerance policy at his company for using a mobile device. He's weighed the risk and he's like, it's better that I do this and not fall asleep. When the driver safety system detects an operator or a driver suffering a lapse in attention, 3 things happen. The first thing is we shake the seat, we sound the alarm, we nudge them back to attention. The next thing we do is we save the data. GPS data, accelerometer data, video data. We know where, when, how far, how fast, how long, and that all gets written to a storage device on board. And then when the system comes into cellular communications, we transmit that data file to Caterpillar's 24/7 operating center, where we have trained safety advisors who are verifying, confirming, categorizing, and analyzing each lapse detected by the NCAP technology. Those trained safety advisors help manage the risks and provide support to implement upstream countermeasures needed to reduce the chance of subsequent, more serious incidents. In other words, there are indications early with a fatigued driver yawning that we can indicate he is in trouble. She is in trouble. Let's intervene. Last year, by the way, Caterpillar has more than 5,000 of these devices installed around the world. And last year, we intervened 1.2 million times to nudge an operator back to attention. Okay, once you have an attentive operator, you can supplement their human vision, their human perception by integrating some cameras to help them see objects and especially people around heavy equipment. So you are probably well aware that non-fatal, struck by and caught in between injuries cost the U.S. companies about $7 billion a year. And according to Liberty Mutual, fatalities on average are resulting in losses of more than $5 billion. Now, I know all of you know that a busy construction site is continually crisscrossed by all kinds of heavy equipment, light vehicles, skid steers, loaders, excavators, pickup trucks, and that equipment backup alarms are probably the most common sound on the job site. It's so common, we've learned to ignore it. And this really increases the risk for workers on the ground. And so studies actually show that an on-foot worker is 2 times more likely to be involved in a fatal accident when the equipment is in backup motion. And according to OSHA, struck by and caught in between earth-moving equipment amounts to about 80% of all the struck by and caught in between incidents. And so, CAT vision systems with personnel detection use a smart camera to prioritize people by actively identifying people on the ground behind the machine. And when a person is detected, the system triggers a visual and audible alert relative to their proximity to the machine. And that smart camera dynamically tracks personnel that are on the ground and delivers intelligent alerts, not just noise like a backup alarm, but an intelligent alert that reflect the dynamic job site conditions and supplement human perception. Now, by addressing fatigue, you have the opportunity to increase performance, reduce costs, improve safety and employee health and wellness. The hardworking people in your companies know that caffeine is not a legitimate layer of protection. They want real layers of protection, facilitated by leaders who understand that fatigue is not laziness. It's not the same as weakness. Leaders who, as Brad pointed out at the end of his presentation there, leaders who are committed to the transition from being responsible for projects to being responsible for people. Leaders who understand that fatigue is natural and that addressing it requires the courage to ask the 5 essential questions of fatigue risk management. Thank you.